Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to a new episode of our Letter to Voxes podcast. Today, we're embarking on a really major deep dive. We're looking at one of the most intellectually rigorous and I think ambitious philosophical projects of the 18th century.
We are. It's Jeremy Bentham's.
Yeah,
An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation.
exactly. And this is the text that laid the absolute foundation for what we now call classical utilitarianism.
It really is. I mean, he was proposing nothing less than a universal, scientific, and almost mathematically quantifiable standard for figuring out what's right and wrong.
Not just for people, but for governments, for good governance.
And our mission today is to get past that simple definition you always hear, the greatest good for the greatest number.
Right. See the machinery behind it.
Yeah, we need to see how Jeremy Bentham actually built that system.
Yeah.
And what's so fascinating about this document is that it wasn't even supposed to be this huge philosophical statement at first.
Oh, really? What was the original plan?
It started out, pretty humbly actually, as just an introduction to a draft penal code.
So like a guide for how to punish people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A guide for structuring punishments. But as he started digging into the core logic of, human behavior and motivation, the whole thing just expanded.
Yeah.
He grew into this massive critique of all existing morality and law.
So what we have is a text that's just rich with the author's own intellectual journey.
And his own self-critique, which is almost obsessive.
We're going to unpack the personal stuff that drove this obsession with systems, look at the nuts and bolts of his philosophical calculus, and then finally see how he defined the exact limits of the state's power to meddle in our lives.
That's going to be a fascinating ride.
Okay, so to understand the system, I feel like we have to understand the system builder. Jeremy Bentham.
Mm-hmm.
He lived from 1748 to 1832, a British philosopher, jurist, a legal reformer. And he just spent his entire life campaigning for rational, efficient laws.
He was so much less interested in tradition than in just results. He looked at the legal structures in England and saw basically a chaotic, uncodified mess that served special interests, not the public good.
And his dedication to reform was, it was absolute. But his legacy is so often overshadowed by his eccentricity.
Oh, yeah. The single most famous detail about him has to be his instruction for what to do after his death.
The famous auto icon.
The auto icon, exactly.
Yeah.
He directed that his skeleton be wired together, padded out with hay, dressed in one of his own black suits, and just seated in a chair on display permanently.
And he didn't just want it on display. He wanted this preserved version of himself to be present at future meetings of his friends and his disciples. That's more than just a weird quirk, isn't it? There's a profound philosophical statement there.
It absolutely is. Think about it. It's the ultimate statement of continuity of intellectual presence.
He's literally still in the room.
He is. For a man obsessed with the permanence of ideas and the systematic application of reason, the auto icon was his way of, enforcing his own legacy, embodying the spirit of the founder forever. He saw himself as the scientific originator of a whole new moral framework.
And his preserved body was the silent proof.
A testament to the utility of his entire life's work.
But that public rigor, that kind of cold, systematic approach, it really contrasts with this deeply sentimental private life that's hinted at in some of the sources.
It does. We hear about his youthful attempts to, court ladies at a place called Bowood House.
And he wasn't very good at it, apparently.
No, not at all. It often ended in, clumsy jokes while playing chess or giving harpsichord lessons. But there's one really poignant moment that the sources recall.
What was that?
Decades later, when he was 80 years old, he wrote to one of those ladies, and he recalled a time when she presented him in ceremony with the flower in the green lane.
Wow, still thinking about it at 80.
Oh, yeah. The writer notes that Bentham couldn't even hear the name Bowood without tears welling up in his eyes. He'd feel compelled to just exclaim, "Take me forward, I entreat you, to the future. Do not let me go back to the past."
That's incredible. The man who created this cold-blooded calculus of emotion was himself haunted by the soft pain of loss.
And it's that very tension, right? The push for perfect order set against the messy reality of human life. That's what colors his famous and very frustrated self-critique of the very book we're talking about.
So he wasn't happy with how it turned out.
Not entirely. He recognized that the structure of the final book didn't quite match his later, much broader vision for a complete legal science. So he laid out 3 key critiques of his own published work.
Okay, so what was the first big issue he had with it? The scope?
The first critique was the title itself, Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation. He felt it was just too broad for what was actually in the book.
That's-
Well, he spent so much time establishing the need for punishment, that's the penal branch of law, that he felt he'd neglected what should have come first,
Which was?
the civil branch, the part of the law that concerns the creation and distribution of rights, things like property, status, personal safety.
Ah, I see. Punishment is just a tool to protect those rights.
Exactly. Punishment, he argued, is merely a means to protect those pre-existing civil rights. So, logically, the framework for rights should have come first and dominated the introduction.
That makes a lot of sense. You have to define what people have before you can define how to punish someone for taking it away. What was his second critique?
The second was about the arrangement of the topics, even within that penal section.
The order was wrong.
Yeah. He came to believe that the detailed division of offenses, cataloging every single type of crime, should have logically come before the discussion of punishment itself.
Define the target before you design the weapon.
You got it. He felt he'd put the cart before the horse, discussing the methods of punishment before he'd exhaustively classified every possible transgression.
Okay, and the third critique. You said this one had a huge impact, moving beyond law and into, psychology and economics.
This is where it gets really, really interesting. He realized later in life that he needed a set of foundational, self-evident truths, he called them axioms, about how the human mind actually values pleasure and pain.
Axioms of mental pathology. That's quite a phrase.
It is. These axioms were meant to be the ultimate standard for how governments should operate, especially when creating and distributing rights and resources.
And the most famous example of one of these axioms is?
The simple yet incredibly profound principle: it is worse to lose than simply not to gain.
That sounds incredibly modern, like something you'd hear in a behavioral economics class today.
It's basically the seed of modern behavioral economics. He recognized that humans don't value gains and losses symmetrically. The psychological pain you feel from losing $10 is way heavier than the pleasure you get from just finding $10.
Loss aversion.
Exactly. This insight anticipates concepts like prospect theory and loss aversion by almost 200 years. And for him, it was fundamental to governing. Any government action that takes something away from you has to account for the higher psychic cost of that loss, even if they replace it with an equal benefit.
So his system needed more than just ethical rules, it needed psychological precision.
Yes. But this lifelong quest for perfect rational order, it met its greatest failure not on the page, but in the physical world.
With the panopticon.
With the panopticon, the inspection house. It was Bentham's brilliant but ultimately doomed prison design.
Can you just quickly describe how it works?
Sure. Architecturally, it was a circular building that allowed a single inspector in a center to, at least potentially, observe all the inmates in their cells.
But the inmates wouldn't know when they were being watched.
That was the genius of it. The power of the design was all psychological. The certainty of possible surveillance would enforce internal obedience. You'd police yourself.
And Bentham poured years into this project.
16 years. He commissioned detailed architectural drawings. He lobbied constantly. This wasn't just a design project for him. He was completely invested.
He even planned to be the contractor governor himself, right? To run it on his own principles.
He did. And he got the land. He even got £2,000 for preliminary work. But in the end, the project was rejected by the aristocratic establishment.
And it crushed him.
Absolutely devastated him. Even though he eventually got a huge compensation payment, £23,000, the personal failure was what stuck with him. He said, "They have murdered my best days."
So what did he think was the real reason for the rejection? It wasn't that it was a bad design.
No. This is what really radicalized him politically. He concluded that the king and the aristocratic elite didn't reject the panopticon because it was flawed. They rejected it because it threatened their own interests.
They rejected it because of what he famously called
sinister interest.
That's such a potent phrase.
And it became the core of his critique of government. Sinister interest is the vested interest of the powerful, the aristocrats, the judges, the clergy conspiring against the broader public good. They benefited from the chaos and inefficiency of the old system.
And the panopticon was too rational, too transparent.
It would have dismantled their power base. This failure convinced Bentham that the only way forward was fundamental constitutional reform. Things like democracy and legal codification were the only way to overcome the ingrained corruption of the ruling class.
So that frustration might have been the political spark, but the intellectual engine for every single one of his reforms was the principle of utility.
The cornerstone.
This is his scientific approach to morality. Let's really dig into the definition. What exactly is utility?
Okay, so for Bentham, utility is the foundational property of any action. He defines it as the property in any object whereby it tends to produce benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness,
More.
or to prevent mischief, pain, evil, or unhappiness for the party whose interest is in question.
So in plain English, it's just the quality of an action that makes it useful for maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering.
That's it. Pleasure and pain are the sovereign masters that govern everything we do.
But this isn't just a guideline for, my personal choices.
Absolutely not. This is universal for him. He insists it has to apply to every action whatsoever, private or public, and that explicitly includes every measure of government.
So government is just a machine for maximizing happiness.
A collective mechanism for it, yes.
Yeah.
And that collective happiness, or what he calls the interest of the community, is nothing more than the sum of the interests of the individual members who compose it.
Okay, wait. If the community interest is just the sum of all our individual interests, that sounds like a monumental amount of calculation.
It is.
How does a government or even a person actually quantify all that pleasure and pain?
Right.
Are we really supposed to weigh my pain against your pleasure and do the math?
And that rigorous need for quantification leads us directly to his most famous invention, the hedonistic calculus, or, as he also called it, the philosophic calculus.
The happiness calculator.
Basically, yeah. Bentham knew that if morality and law were going to be scientific, they couldn't just rely on vague feelings. They needed standardized dimensions for measurement. So he gave us 7 criteria for measuring the value of any lot of pleasure or pain.
Okay, this is the core mechanism of the whole system. Let's break these 7 dimensions down one by one.
Right, so the first 4 are really about the experience itself for the individual.
So number 1 is?
Intensity. How strong is the pleasure or the pain? A mild inconvenience versus agonizing torture.
Obvious enough. Number 2.
Duration. How long does it last? A brief, intense pleasure might be outweighed by a mild pleasure that lasts for years.
Okay, intensity, duration. What's third?
Certainty or uncertainty. How likely is this pleasure or pain to actually happen? A small, certain gain is often better than a large, improbable one.
And the fourth of this group?
Proximity or remoteness. How soon will you feel it? We naturally discount things that are far off in the future. An immediate pleasure carries more weight than a distant one.
So those first 4, intensity, duration, certainty, proximity, they're the psychological inputs. They reflect how we naturally weigh things.
They do. But the calculus goes further. It has to assess the consequences of the consequences, the ripple effects.
And that's where the last 3 criteria come in.
Exactly. This is what makes it useful for long-term planning for law. Number 5 is fecundity, or productiveness.
Fecundity? What does that mean?
It's the chance that the initial feeling has of being followed by more feelings of the same kind.
Can you give an example?
Sure. The pleasure of learning a new skill is highly fecund. It opens doors, it makes you more likely to enjoy more learning, to achieve more goals, creating more pleasure down the line.
Okay, I get it. And the 6th one sounds like the opposite of that. Purity.
Right. Purity is the chance that the feeling has of not being followed by feelings of the opposite kind. Does it have a hangover? A pure pleasure doesn't come with guilt or negative side effects. The pleasure from a long hike might be quite pure.
Well, the pleasure from, say, binge drinking is highly impure because it's often followed by pain and regret.
Precisely. And then finally, the 7th and maybe most important for government is extent.
This is the social dimension.
This is where it scales up. It's simply the number of people affected by the feeling. Once you've calculated the intensity, duration, purity, and so on for one person, you multiply it by the number of people who experience it. That's how individual interest becomes community interest.
The sheer analytical effort here is just, it's stunning. He's not just saying do good, he's giving you a step-by-step checklist.
And this emphasis on measurement and maximization, it really does set the stage for so much of modern decision science, especially in economics.
But because he believed he'd found the one true objective standard, he was pretty aggressive in attacking any other ethical systems.
Oh, very. He identified 2 main principles adverse to utility that he thought were just fundamentally flawed and dangerous.
The first one, the principle of asceticism, sounds like the exact opposite of utility.
It is. It's the formal inverse. The principle of asceticism approves of actions only insofar as they diminish happiness and disapproves of them if they augment it.
Where does an idea like that even come from?
He traced it to 2 main sources. One was philosophical people seeking honor or reputation by rejecting simple pleasures. The other was religious people, driven by a superstitious fear of a vengeful God who they believed demanded suffering from them.
And he said the religious camp often went even further.
Yeah, they would make it a positive duty to court pain. But Bentham just dismisses this as completely unsustainable. If everyone did it, society would just collapse.
It's self-limiting.
Exactly. And this leads to a really important point about punishment. Bentham argues that even the vilest pleasure which the vilest of malefactors ever reaped from his crime would not be a bad thing if that pleasure stood alone, with no consequences.
So the pleasure itself isn't the problem.
Never. The sole reason for punishment, he insists, is the quantity of pain and mischief that flows from the crime. The utilitarian judge doesn't punish the pleasure, they punish the negative consequences.
Which is a crucial distinction. And that brings us to the second adverse principle, the principle of sympathy and antipathy. This sounds more like just gut feelings.
This is the one he thought was the most dangerous, because it's anarchical, despotic. This is the principle that governs when a person approves or disapproves of an act just because they feel like it. They hold up that feeling as a sufficient standard in itself.
So if I just feel deep down that something is wrong, even if I can't point to any measurable harm it causes, I'm operating under this principle.
You are. And Bentham calls it despotic and anarchical because it means there are as many standards of right and wrong as there are men. It gets disguised with respectable language, common sense, law of nature, rule of right, but underneath it's just arbitrary emotion.
But wait a minute, isn't some level of sympathy, basic human empathy, necessary for good government? Is he really saying we should all be cold, calculating machines?
That's a great question, and it's a key distinction. He's not arguing that the feeling of sympathy or antipathy should be eliminated. He's arguing that the feeling itself can never be the ground or the justification for a moral or legal standard.
So if my gut feeling happens to align with utility, that's fine.
It's fine, but the reason the action is right is because of the utility, not because of your gut. The danger, as he saw it, is that antipathy is most apt to err on the side of severity. It becomes a cloak to despotism, letting people inflict misery on others under the cover of their own pure, unexamined intentions.
Okay, so if the principle of utility tells us what we should do, the next logical step is figuring out what actually compels us to do it.
Mm-hmm.
What are the real-world mechanisms of pleasure and pain that give the law its teeth? Bentham groups these into 4 systems. He calls them the 4 sanctions.
Right. And these sanctions are just the 4 distinct sources from which pleasure and pain rewards and punishments can flow. They're what act as motives for our behavior.
So what's the first one?
The first is the physical sanction. This is pleasure or pain that comes directly from the natural course of things. No human or supernatural intervention. If you touch a hot stove, you get burned. That's the physical sanction.
The laws of nature, basically. Okay, what's second?
The political sanction. This is the pain or pleasure that's handed out by a specific official group of people, a judge, a magistrate acting on behalf of the sovereign or the state.
So if I'm speeding, the political sanction is the cop giving me a ticket.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if you crash, the physical sanction is the pain from the impact.
Got it. What are the other 2?
The third and fourth are about social and theological forces. Number 3 is the moral or popular sanction. This is the pain or pleasure you get from just casual, everyday people in your community based on what they think of your character.
Reputation.
Reputation, social ostracism, public approval, all of that. If your neighbors stop talking to you because they think you're a jerk, that's the moral sanction at work. It's informal, but it can be incredibly powerful.
And the last one?
The religious sanction. This is the pain or pleasure you expect to get from a superior, invisible being, either in this life or the next. Heaven, hell, divine retribution, that sort of thing.
It's a really comprehensive system for classifying where pressure comes from. But this brings us back to motives. The traditional way of thinking about morality is all about intent. Good motives mean you're a good person.
Right.
But Bentham's system leads to a much more radical conclusion about our human drives.
A very radical conclusion. He insists on this crucial point.
Yeah.
No motive is either constantly good or constantly bad.
Wait, that sounds completely counterintuitive. How can a motive like, say, hatred not be inherently bad?
For Bentham, motives are just the internal spring of action. They're the energy that makes us do things. They only get a moral label, good or bad, based on the most frequent complexion of their effects.
So the outcome.
Always the outcome. Take sexual desire. It's a neutral impulse. We only label it with a bad term like lust when the action it leads to is harmful, like coercion or adultery. The message to the lawmaker is crystal clear. Judge the act by its predictable consequences, its tendency, not the motive that kicked it off.
Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like if you enjoy this deep dive.
So, to continue, this really divorces the law from the business of judging what's in your heart.
It only cares about the observable outcome.
It creates a fully external, consequence-based system. Think about the classic example he uses. Pecuniary interest, the desire for money. If you kill someone's rival for money, your motive gets labeled lucre or avarice, and everyone condemns it as bad. But if you plow a field for a farmer for money, your motive is called industry, and we see it as neutral or even good.
But the internal drive, the desire for money, is exactly the same in both cases.
Identical. The only difference is the consequence of the action. The labels we use are just shorthand for the usual outcome of that particular energy.
Okay, so if motives are neutral, how does he think about a person's overall character or disposition?
A person's disposition, for him, is just the sum of their intentions, and those intentions are born from motives. So when we want to measure how depraved a person's disposition is, we look at the conflict between two kinds of motives.
Seducing versus tutelary.
Exactly. Seducing motives are the ones that push us toward harmful acts. The tutelary motives are the restraining factors, the constant checks that pull us back.
And what are the main tutelary motives that we all have, the things that generally keep us in line?
Bentham identifies 4 standing tutelary motives that are always at work. First, goodwill or benevolence, just the natural desire to see other people happy.
Okay.
Second, love of reputation. We want other people to think well of us. That's driven by the moral sanction. Third, the desire of amity, the desire for friendship and close relationships.
And the fourth is religion.
Right. And he notes that even though religious rules often conflict with utility, it still acts as a constant check against a lot of selfish vices.
So when someone does something bad, the depravity of their character is measured by how strong the temptation, the seducing motive had to be to overcome all those built-in restraints.
You've got it. If a tiny temptation makes you do something terrible, your disposition is judged as highly depraved. If it takes a massive temptation like extreme hunger or mortal danger, the disposition is seen as less depraved.
But he ends on a kind of optimistic note, doesn't he?
He does. He believed that the general and standing bias of every man's nature is toward the side of the social motives: goodwill, amity, reputation. He thought society, by its very nature, encourages us to behave in ways that maximize utility.
So with that philosophical foundation all set, we can finally move to how this all gets applied to legislation. The law has to categorize and analyze human behavior with, like, clinical precision.
It does. For a rational penal code to work, every conceivable human action needs to be defined. So Bentham gives us several key distinctions.
What's the first one?
Positive versus negative. A positive act involves motion or exertion like striking someone. A negative act is about forbearance or omission like not bringing someone food, which we call starving them, or failing to pay a tax.
And that distinction between action and omission is so important for things like negligence in modern law.
Crucial. Then you have external versus internal. External acts are the observable things your body does. Internal acts are mental intention, contemplation. The law can only directly regulate external acts, but the internal acts are what determine the quality of that external act.
Right. And the last one is transient versus continued.
Yeah, a transient act is momentary, like a punch. A continued act lasts over time, like leaning on someone or providing for a child. This affects when a crime is considered complete.
But what's really fascinating is his emphasis on circumstances. He says the action itself is neutral. The circumstances determine everything.
Everything. Any imaginable object can be a circumstance of an act, and he gives this extreme paradox to make the point. In some circumstances, even to kill a man may be a beneficial act. In others, to set food before him may be a pernicious one.
Killing in self-defense versus poisoning someone with that food.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Intentionality and circumstances are all that matter. And he uses this great historical anecdote about the death of King William II to break down just how complex intentionality can be.
With Sir Walter Tyrrell's arrow.
Right. So, for legal purposes, intentionality can be about the act itself, the consequences, or the circumstances. If Tyrrell intended to shoot the arrow, that's intention regarding the act. But did he intend the consequence?
Did he mean to hit the king?
Right. If he knew the king was there and aimed at him, the consequence is intentional. If he was just shooting at a deer and had no idea the king was anywhere nearby, the consequence, the king's death, is unintentional. The law has to figure out what the person intended, not just that they acted.
Okay, so once we've identified an act that has a pernicious tendency, one that reduces utility, We have to analyze its total negative consequence. This is what Bentham calls mischief.
Right. And he divides this total mischief into two parts to justify punishment.
Let's start with the direct harm.
That's the primary mischief. This is the direct pain or loss suffered by a specific assignable person. It's the immediate injury, the stolen wallet, the broken arm.
And then there's the wider social cost, the secondary mischief.
And this is where it gets really interesting for law. Secondary mischief is divided into two branches, alarm and danger.
Alarm and danger. What's the difference?
The alarm is the collective pain of apprehension. It's the fear that you or others might suffer the same fate. When you hear about a robbery down the street, you feel alarm. It requires that the original victim was an assignable person.
Okay, so alarm is the fear of being next. What's danger?
The danger is the probability that the community is now exposed to more of this mischief in the future. It operates through the influence of example. When a crime goes unpunished, it signals to everyone else that maybe crime pays, which makes them more likely to do it too.
So danger is the erosion of the social contract.
It is. And he uses the example of not paying your taxes to show the difference.
Okay, how does that work?
Non-payment of a tax is a negative act. The primary mischief is the specific amount of money the Treasury loses. The secondary mischief includes a huge amount of danger. If one person gets away with it, others will be tempted to do the same, and the whole system could collapse.
But, he says, it produces no alarm. Why not? The public is harmed by a lack of tax revenue.
Because the individuals affected are unassignable and out of sight. No single person feels an immediate fear that they will be personally harmed by that one act of tax evasion. The harm is too diffuse and abstract, so there's real danger to the system, but no personal alarm.
And this whole systematic analysis of consequences is the only justification for the state to use punishment.
The only one. The immediate goal of punishment is simply to control action, either the offender's future actions or the actions of others through example.
And that's achieved through reformation or incapacitation, like prison.
Right. But even when utility seems to demand punishment, Bentham lays out these 4 strict conditions. The case is unmeet, where punishment must not be inflicted because it would actually cause a net loss of utility.
These are fundamental limits on state power. What's the first case?
The first is where punishment is groundless. This is where there was no real mischief to prevent in the first place. For example, if a person fully consented to a risky activity, inflicting pain, there would be a net negative for society.
Okay, that makes sense. The second is when punishment is inefficacious.
This covers all the classic legal exemptions. Infancy, insanity, intoxication, being physically forced to do something. If a person can't understand the threat of punishment or can't control their actions, then punishing them does nothing to control future behavior. It's just inflicting useless pain.
And the third case is the ultimate utilitarian test. Unprofitable or too expensive.
This is the cost-benefit analysis at the heart of the whole system. Punishment is wrong if the mischief caused by the punishment itself, the cost to the prison, the pain to the offender, the harm to their family outweighs the mischief of the original crime.
And finally, the fourth case, where punishment is just needless.
Right. Punishment is needless if the same goal-controlling action can be achieved at a cheaper rate. If education or a warning or some other non-coercive method would work, then using the heavy, costly machinery of state punishment is inefficient and therefore, for Bentham, morally wrong. Punishment is always the last resort.
So Bentham has built this universal standard with utility, and he set the criteria for state intervention. Now he has to draw the line. He has to define the boundary between what the law should regulate and what has to be left to private conscience.
Private ethics. And this distinction is absolutely paramount for a liberal society. This is the limit on government control.
So how does he break it down?
He says that ethics, in general, covers 3 areas of a person's behavior, all aimed at maximizing their own happiness: prudence, probity, and beneficence.
Let's take those one by one. Prudence.
Prudence is your duty to yourself. Actions where only you are really interested in the outcome. Your diet, your exercise, how you manage your money.
Okay, and probity.
Probity is your duty to others, specifically to abstain from harming them. Not stealing, not assaulting, the do no harm part of ethics.
And beneficence is the positive side of that.
Right. Beneficence is also a duty to others, but it's about actively doing things to benefit them. Charity, helping a neighbor, and so on.
So law and ethics both want the same thing, to maximize happiness. But why can't the law intervene everywhere? Why can't the state pass a law forcing me to exercise, which is a matter of prudence?
There are 2 main reasons for them. First, a legislator just cannot know the individual circumstances. well enough to make good laws about your private life. Everyone's health and tastes are different.
It's too complex for a one-size-fits-all law.
Exactly. And second, and this is more important, trying to enforce duties to oneself by law would almost always be unprofitable. It would bring in more mischief than the original vice.
Can you give an example of how that would work?
He uses this powerful historical example of Louis XIV trying to force religious conversions in France. The goal might have been, moral purity, but the violent coercion ended up tearing the bonds of sympathy asunder. It destroyed social trust. The violence of the state caused far more pain, a huge net loss of utility, than the vice it was trying to cure.
So the law has to stick mostly to probity, preventing clear harm to others, and stay out of prudence.
Pretty much. And that focus is what leads to his classification of legal offenses. The whole system is organized around the different objects that can be harmed.
And he has 4 main categories for those.
4 main categories of assignable objects, yes. 1, offenses against person affecting life, health, etc. 2, offenses against property. 3, offenses against reputation, things like libel that damage your standing in the community.
The moral sanction.
Exactly. And 4, offenses against condition, which affects the benefits you get from special relationships, like being a parent, a spouse, a guardian.
And this whole idea of a natural arrangement of laws was central to his huge critique of the English common law system.
Oh, he absolutely despised it. He called it judiciary law, or a fictitious composition which has no known person for its author. He thought it was opaque, inconsistent, based on obscure tradition instead of clear principles.
So his system, based on utility, was meant to be the clear scientific alternative.
The only rational alternative, because utility, he argued, is a principle that, once you understand it, is recognized by all people. It's universal.
But to get that clarity, he had to deal with the abstract language of the law itself. He argues a lot of legal terms like right don't actually exist in the real world.
He calls them fictitious entities. Terms like right, power, duty, obligation. They aren't tangible objects. They're fictions we've created. So to understand what they really mean, you have to trace them back to real entities.
And for him, the only real entities are
pleasure and pain. Observable instances of pleasure and pain.
So how does a concept like a right get traced back to pleasure and pain?
Okay, take property. My right to my car is a fictitious entity. It doesn't physically exist. It's created not by giving me a command, but by imposing obligations on everyone else to not interfere with my car.
And those obligations are enforced by the threat of pain.
The threat of the political sanction if they violate it. So a right is just a permission slip for me to get pleasure from something, backed up by the threat of pain for others. The entire vocabulary of law, Bentham insisted, has to be grounded in the real, quantifiable currency of utility.
So we've mapped out this colossal effort by Jeremy Bentham to create a fully rational scientific standard for human behavior and government. It really is an astonishing monument to systemic thinking.
It is. And to briefly recap the central statements, the main takeaways from this deep dive.
Go for it.
First, the foundation of all morality and law is the principle of utility. That means maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain for the greatest number. The community's interest is just the sum of individual interests.
Right. Second,
all actions and policies have to be assessed with the felicific calculus. It's a comprehensive measurement system with dimensions like intensity, duration, certainty, and so on.
Okay. Third point.
Third, motives are ethically neutral. This is a big one. Only the predictable consequences of an action determine its moral and legal value. The law judges the outcome, not the impulse.
And finally, number 4.
Law should only intervene where punishment is effective, profitable, and necessary. It should focus almost exclusively on probity, preventing harm to others, and leave duties to oneself. Prudence, mostly to private ethics, to avoid causing even more social harm through state overreach.
Now, for a final provocative thought, let's go back to the radical scope of Bentham's definition of suffering. His very mechanical approach to morality, focusing on the capacity to feel pain rather than the ability to reason, led him to challenge the traditional boundary between humans and animals.
He did. He famously posed what has become the definitive question for this whole area of ethics. Regarding non-human animals, he said, the question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer?
And that just completely reframes the entire basis of moral consideration.
It does. So the final thought for you to ponder is this. If suffering is the sole universal metric for moral and legal inclusion, the capacity to be a victim of mischief, how does adopting that pure utilitarian focus fundamentally challenge the boundaries we draw in our own laws today? If we accept Bentham's rigorous methodology, where does the domain of utility-based law truly end?
That is the ultimate test of his foundational principle.